She meant it as etiquette, but it landed like a slap. If respect is real, why does it need to hide behind polished words? Would you let someone test your worth at their table and still call it love? This is the story of Camilla Miller Greer, a woman who learned that legacy without kindness is just a costume, and of Amari Goroff, a gifted musician torn between a mother's approval and a partner's dignity. Listen close. The lesson is simple, the price is not. But before we begin, if you enjoy powerful, thought-provoking stories drawn from real lives, tales of love, betrayal, mistakes, and second chances, I'd be grateful if you gave this video a like and hit subscribe. It helps others discover this corner where life itself writes the most dramatic scripts, and share with me in the comments. Where are you watching from and what time is it right now? It's always fascinating to see how these stories travel across the world and connect us all. Now take a deep breath, clear your mind, and let's step together into a story that just might change the way you look at life. Mila stood at the window with both palms against the cool glass, steadying her breath the way her mother had taught her long ago. Tomorrow meant vows and quiet promises, a dress waiting on its hanger, a ring that already felt heavier than gold. Her phone lit her face. Omari's message arrived without preamble, clean and formal as a line break. My mother wants to see you tonight. Family tradition. She read it twice. Tradition could be a welcome, but it could also be a gate. She felt the thin crack of worry and chose not to patch it. She put on a simple evening dress, smoothed the fabric the way one smooths a thought, kissed Sophia on the cheek and met Eldrick's wordless nod. She told herself she was going to dinner, not a trial. She knew better than to believe it fully, but she went. Omari opened the door with that careful smile he wore when he wanted peace for everyone. He reached for her coat, folded it with the practiced neatness of someone who avoids conflict by tidying edges. His eyes searched hers for ease, and met a question instead. He whispered what sons say to keep the table calm. It'll be fine. She answered with a small nod that cost less than a speech. Inside, the house presented itself like a resume. On one wall, a constellation of framed photographs. Graduations, recitals, travel portraits where posture did most of the talking. Along another, a ribbon of art pieces, abstracts and portraits, hung to be admired and remembered for who had chosen them. A grand piano sat where light could find its gloss, lid closed, promising control more than song. Everything smelled faintly of polish and a scent that wanted to be timeless. Dr. Iman appeared versed, posture precise, dressed the colour of deep wine. Pearls quiet at her collar. Her smile was exact, not unkind, but appraising. Her greeting landed with the softness of velvet over wood. "Welcome, dear. You look fresh." The word praised without admitting a quality. Mila thanked her, the way one thanks a precise forecast before the rain. Alexander, Nick, rose from the sofa too quickly, as if summoned by a string. His face held warmth that kept checking the doorway, a kindness that listened for permission. He extended a glass with both hands and nearly asked his wife with his eyes if this was the right move. When she gave the faintest nod, he relaxed and added the gentlest approval he could afford. "We're glad you're here." The sentence sounded true and supervised. They sat. Conversation moved in tidy arcs. Iman asked about upbringing, mentors, plans after the wedding. She complimented Mila's diction, the carriage of her shoulders, the economy of her answers. Each note sounded like a polished bell, clear, measured, cool. Nick offered anecdotes that fizzled at the edges, as if he'd learned to tell stories in rooms where endings must be safe. Omari tried to close distances with small touches and missed them by a breath each time. Mila let her eyes return to the photographs. In one, a younger Omari stood between his parents, jaw set as if harmony required effort. In another, Iman held a program and a smile that looked exactly like this one. The piano's closed lid caught Mila's reflection and handed it back with a shine she did not trust. Dessert arrived early. Iman lifted a spoon and placed a compliment precisely where it would not bloom. "Your poise is impressive for someone so young." Mila accepted it with a quiet, "Thank you." Inside, she wrote the sentence as it truly read, "You may belong, but not as a peer." At the door, Nick helped with her coat again, eager to be helpful, eager not to be wrong. Iman pressed Mila's hand with that velvet overwood warmth. "Tomorrow is sacred to our family." Omari touched his forehead to Mila's, voice low. Tonight was just a courtesy. She looked past him, through the framed stories and the closed piano, and heard her own thought answer back. This was not just dinner. Outside, Mila held the rail and counted 3 slow breaths. She typed a brief message to her mother and kept the long version for later. Tradition, she told herself, is a choice wearing an heirloom. She had seen the heirlooms. Now she needed to know the choice. And somewhere behind her, a wooden box she had not yet seen waited for its moment to open. The dining room waited already dressed, as if it had been set long before Mila was invited. The table stretched wide, each place lit by crystal reflections. Silverware aligned like soldiers, porcelain dishes balanced with perfect symmetry, glasses thin as air. Orchids sat in the centre, their white blossoms chosen not for warmth but for prestige. Mila moved her chair gently, careful not to disturb the pattern. Omari leaned close as though to soften the edge of the formality. Just dinner. But his voice betrayed strain, the way it cracked softly at the end. She nodded, though she saw the truth in his restless hands. De Iman presided with the ease of someone accustomed to rooms obeying her pace. She carved a small portion of fish, set her fork down, and spoke as if the words were already carved in stone. A musician's wife must understand that her role is larger than affection. She represents the family, the art, and the legacy. Only women of strong houses can manage that burden. The remark floated across the table with the weight of final judgment. Mila lifted her glass and sipped, not to drink, but to give herself the seconds to answer. She smiled politely, letting silence say more than any defence. Her calmness unsettled the air. Nick cleared his throat, his hand trembling slightly against the stem of his glass. He forced a smile that begged for peace. "A toast," he announced, "to unions that honour both love and tradition, to couples who understand their duty to continue what came before." His eyes darted toward his wife for approval before landing awkwardly on Mila. He raised the glass higher, as if height could strengthen the sentiment. The others echoed with soft clinks of crystal. Mila touched her glass to the rim before her and took the smallest swallow. Legacy had a flavour tonight, bitter under the polish. As the plates changed, the conversation grew more pointed. Iman praised certain marriages by name, each one paired with emphasis on wealth, reputation, or lineage. "Some families," she said with a glance sharp as cut glass, "understand their place. Others try too hard to enter circles not meant for them." The laughter that followed was polite and thin. Mila responded with warmth, choosing to speak about work, about the pride of building stories that carried truth across divides. She held her voice even, showing she was not shaken. Yet her eyes searched for Omari's. He looked down at his plate, tracing crumbs with his fork, unable to hold her gaze. The absence of his support pressed harder than any insult. Near the end of the course, Miss Adeline entered with the grace of someone who had seen decades of families rise and fall at this very table. She refilled a glass, placed a new plate, and let her eyes pause on Iman, then on Mila. The look carried no words but spoke volumes. She understood the tone. She marked the imbalance. Dessert arrived into more porcelain bowls, garnished with deliberate elegance. Iman offered another faint smile and spoke of tomorrow as if it were already settled in her favour. Mila listened, chin lifted, eyes steady. Inside, she carried the weight of a thought she would not yet speak. This family measured people like artefacts, and she would not be displayed. The meal closed with polite exchanges, but the cracks beneath the silver and crystal had widened. When they rose from the table, Mila's steps felt heavier but clearer. She knew now that tonight was not about food or welcome. It was about boundaries, about who was seen as inside and who was kept as other. And if this was only the beginning, she wondered how sharp the next test would be. When the plates were cleared and the room hushed into that heavy silence only certain houses know, Dr. Iman rose from her chair. She crossed to a cabinet carved from dark wood, opened a drawer and lifted a small box wrapped in worn leather. The gesture carried no ceremony of affection, only authority. She set it in front of Mila with a soft thud that spoke louder than words. "This," Iman said, her tone polished as ever, "has belonged to our family for generations. Every woman who steps into this house learns its lesson. Tonight, so will you." Her fingers opened the clasp. Inside lay old documents, photographs, and a few folded sheets of poetry. She drew one out, unfolding it with deliberate care. She recited a verse in French, her voice firm but not fluent. The line hung in the air like a stone thrown into water. Mila listened, allowed a pause, then repeated the verse with clear pronunciation. She explained its meaning, a reflection on simplicity, the discipline of tending one's own garden before judging the world. The explanation was calm, exact, and confident. Iman's smile stiffened, her eyes narrowing a fraction. She reached back into the box and withdrew a small reproduction of a painting. "And this?" she asked, sliding it across the table. The image showed a crowded harbour, lights scattering across the water. Mila leaned in, studying it as though she were back in class. "It is not only about ships," she said quietly. "It is about motion, about labour and wealth moving together." The artist captures the idea of trade as the rhythm of life. Notice the contrast. Workers in shadow, merchants in brightness. He understood division. The room stayed still. Nick shifted in his seat, his eyes darting nervously between his wife and the young woman who answered too well. Omari sat frozen, his hand clenched around his napkin, silent as if distance could protect him from the test unfolding. Iman cleared her throat and selected another card, and she read aloud, a phrase heavy with accent. "Translate." Mila did, without pause. Then, in the same language, she expanded the phrase into a short reflection, fluent and smooth. Her tone was unhurried, the cadence natural, as though she had spoken that tongue since childhood. A low breath escaped from Miss Adeline, standing in the corner, though she quickly pressed her lips closed. Even the servant had caught the difference. Iman was testing and Mila was passing without strain. At last, Iman shut the box with a snap. "Not bad," she said, "for a first attempt." Her eyes held a gleam that was not admiration but calculation. But understand, this was only a warm-up. Real tests do not come so easily. Mila bowed her head slightly, answering nothing, though her steady gaze betrayed no fear. She had given back every question polished, every word precise, yet she knew the real challenge was not in the box. It was in the silence of the man beside her. Omari still had not spoken, had not lifted a word in her defense or in her praise. His silence stretched long enough to feel like distance. For Mila, it was the first clear crack, small, sharp, and undeniable. The evening ended with murmured courtesies, but the air was colder than when it began. Mila stepped into the night knowing the shkatulka held more than heirlooms. It held the family's weapon, and she understood. They were not finished. The chairs had been pulled closer, the light softened to give the illusion of intimacy. Plates had been cleared, leaving only glasses and small bowls of sugared fruit. The conversation shifted from art and language to what Iman called wisdom passed down. Her voice slowed, drawing everyone in, though the direction of her words was clear from the first syllable. "In life," she said with an almost tender smile, "water seeks its own level. One does not mix oil with water. Harmony depends on balance, and balance means each element must remain where it belongs." The sentence hung in the air, heavy with the weight of what was left unsaid. Nick chuckled softly, almost rehearsed, and repeated, "Balance. Yes. Oil and water cannot share the same glass." His laugh was thin, but it gave the others permission. The family circle joined in with low, satisfied smiles. Mila felt her jaw tighten. Her lips remained curved in a polite shape, but her teeth pressed hard together. She knew the story was not told for its imagery. It was a mirror angled toward her. She lifted her glass, drank slowly, and placed it down with deliberate care. Every motion was measured, so no one could claim she lost her poise. Omari shifted uncomfortably in his seat. He kept his eyes on the tablecloth, tracing the embroidered folds, unwilling to lift his gaze to hers. His silence echoed louder than the laughter. From the corner, Miss Adeline carried a tray with fresh cups. She moved quietly, as always, but when the laughter settled, she let slip a whisper, low but clear enough for Mila to catch. "I have heard that one before." Her tone carried no judgment, only weary recognition, as though this parable had been used many times as a tool of dismissal. The remark faded into the soft clink of cups, but its truth lingered. Mila straightened her shoulders. If they wanted to wrap exclusion in the clothing of proverbs, she would answer in a language they did not expect. She would not fight on the terrain of ancestry or geography. When Iman looked her way, waiting for a reaction, Mila gave a calm smile. "Balance is not geography," she said evenly. "It is not where water flows or oil floats. Balance is ethics. It is how one chooses to treat others, That is what decides whether a home stands in harmony. For the first time, the room did not rush to laughter. Nick cleared his throat but found no words. Omari pressed his palms together, still staring down. Iman's smile tightened, held for a moment too long, then was released with a sip of her drink. The statement had not been challenged, but neither was it welcomed. Miss Adeline set the final cup on the table and bowed her head slightly. The gesture, small as it was, felt like an acknowledgement, a recognition that the young woman had spoken a truth rarely voiced in that room. The night wore on with small talk about music programs and scheduled travels, but the tension had been written into the folds of the tablecloth. Mila understood. This family's legacy was not about culture's geography or the Polish of language. It was about control, and control always searched for cracks. The evening drew to its closing ritual. Coats prepared, cups emptied, polite farewells rehearsed in tone before they were spoken. Yet the air in the room did not soften. It carried the weight of unspoken truths, layered carefully under every smile. Mila stood near the doorway, her dress falling in quiet folds, her eyes steady as the family moved through their well-rehearsed parting gestures. Nick carried a tray of glasses, his hands trembling from nerves more than from weight. He tried to steady them, pressing his knuckles tight against the silver rim. Iman lingered at the threshold, voice cool as she began a final phrase. "Remember, dear, water and oil do not mix. Each must remain where it belongs." She smiled faintly, expecting obedience dressed as agreement. Mila's jaw tightened once, then eased. She leaned forward just enough to make her words intimate, but not confrontational. "If your wisdom is about separation," she said softly, "then it names you as much as it names me." The words landed without noise, yet their echo broke the room apart. Nick's tray slipped, crystal shattering across the floor. His face turned pale, his apology frozen in his throat. Iman blinked, once, then twice. Her practiced elegance cracked in Sisham's before breaking into a sharp exhale. "How dare you?" she began, but the rhythm of her control faltered. The pearls at her neck caught the light, but her composure no longer did. Omari stepped forward, eyes wide, voice caught between fear and pleading. "Mila, what have you done?" His tone was not anger, but desperation. The sound of someone watching two worlds collide in front of him. Mila held her ground. Her voice stayed calm, level, free of trembling. "I did not shout. I only repeated what was offered. If division is the heart of your lesson, then you must accept its mirror. You cannot call others lesser without confessing what you believe about yourselves." The silence after was still sharper than broken glass. Nick bent to gather the shards, his hands clumsy, his shoulders hunched as though he could sweep away more than fragments. Iman's face flushed with something far from dignity, something raw, exposed, unsettled. Omari stood motionless, torn between the woman he loved and the family that raised him. His silence revealed what his heart could not decide. The air trembled with the weight of that choice, but Mila no longer searched his eyes for confirmation. She had spoken not to provoke, but to reveal. As she reached for her coat, her fingers steady, she thought of her mother's voice from childhood. Never match cruelty with volume. Answer it with clarity. Tonight she'd done just that, and clarity had left the house trembling. The door closed behind her with finality, but she knew this was not the end. The masks had slipped. The true test was still waiting. The wedding day unfolded exactly as everyone had rehearsed. Smiles for the photographs, scripted vows before witnesses, applause timed like music. The dress was flawless, the rings exchanged smoothly, the kiss brief and clean. Guests clapped with delight, cameras caught every angle, and to all eyes the union appeared perfect. But beneath the lace and ritual, Mila carried emptiness. Each promise spoken felt as though it belonged to someone else's voice. The weight of the ring was real, but it pressed not with love, only with expectation. She smiled because that was her part to play. Omari smiled too, though his eyes carried the shadows of last night's silence. By evening, when the guests dispersed, the circle grew smaller. It was time for what Iman called the first family dinner of the newlyweds. The room was the same stage as before, only now the audience was closer, fewer outsiders to soften the edge. Mila changed into a refined evening gown, calmer than her wedding dress, but in her heart no garment could cover the fracture. At the table, crystal glasses waited again. Nick lifted his in ritual. To harmony and tradition, he declared, voice stronger now, encouraged by the absence of strangers. The others joined him. Omari touched his glass lightly to Mila's, eyes lowered, no words offered. The meal began with rehearsed conversation, compliments on the ceremony, remarks about the food. Then, when plates were cleared and laughter hung loose, Iman's voice carried again, smooth as silk over a blade. "There is an old saying," she said, glancing briefly toward Mila before turning to the others. "Oil does not mix with water, no matter how long you stir. Each must remain in its place. That is how order is kept." This time no pretense of ambiguity. The words landed openly, deliberately. Laughter followed in unison, sharper and louder than the night before. Nick chuckled obediently, the older relatives nodded with approving smiles, and the sound rolled across the table like a verdict. Mila sat still, her spine straight, her jaw tight enough to ache. She did not answer with a smile. She simply placed her fork down, folding her napkin with precise care. The gesture was louder than any reply. She looked once at Omari, searching his face for courage, for a voice to rise beside hers. He kept his head bowed, his hands clasped, silent. The silence cut deeper than the proverb. He had chosen stillness when she needed truth. Miss Adeline moved quietly along the edge of the room, her gaze fixed on the young woman's hands. She saw the napkin folded, the gesture of finality, and she understood. Some goodbyes are spoken without words. Mila rose. Her chair slid back softly against the polished floor. Every head turned, expecting apology, perhaps laughter to mend the moment. Instead, she lifted her coat from the chair, straightened her shoulders, and walked out. No voice followed her. Not Omari's, not Iman's. Only silence and the faint echo of crystal glasses shifting in uncertain hands. On the threshold, Mila paused long enough to feel the weight of the moment. This was the Rubicon. The line that once crossed could not be retraced. The evening was meant to bind her to their legacy. Instead, it freed her. Mila's apartment greeted her with silence, the kind that felt more like safety than emptiness. She dropped her coat across the back of a chair and stood by the window. The wedding ring still glinted on her hand, a reminder of vows spoken hours earlier, but it felt less like a promise and more like a shackle she hadn't chosen. She pressed her forehead to the glass and let the cold surface cool her thoughts. Her mother, Sophia, appeared quietly, her robe tied loose, her eyes filled with that softness only mothers carry. She did not rush forward with demands or questions. She simply touched Mila's arm and said, "You don't have to explain tonight. Just breathe." The words did not press. They opened space. Eldrick joined them, leaning against the doorway with the calm weight of someone who had seen storms before. "Dignity isn't negotiable," he said simply. His voice held no command, only quiet conviction. "You decide what kind of life you'll live. We'll stand by it." The three of them sat in the kitchen, tea steeping slowly in chipped cups. Mila explained fragments, the table, the proverbs, the laughter that felt like arrows. She did not raise her voice, but every detail sharpened as it left her lips. Sophia nodded, her hand resting over Mila's with steady warmth. Eldrick shook his head once, not in anger, but in disbelief that anyone could dress cruelty in silk and call it wisdom. When the clock struck midnight, her phone began to buzz. Omari's name lit the screen again and again. At first, she turned it face down, then she silenced it. By the third call, she powered it off. Sophia caught her eye and offered only a nod. Eldrick said nothing, but the approval in his silence was clear. In the small hours, Mila sat alone at the table. She slid the ring off her finger, turning it slowly between her hands. Her heart ached with the truth. She had loved Omari deeply, but love without respect was a hunger that devoured itself. She whispered it aloud, not for anyone else but for herself. "I loved, but not at any cost." The words settled like a cornerstone. Not rage, not despair, just a declaration. Near dawn, her cousin Nyla arrived, slipping inside with her usual energy dimmed by concern. She listened as Mila recounted the evening, every insult wrapped in false courtesy. Nyla leaned forward, eyes sharp. "Don't bury this in a post, cousin. Write it. Not for the world to scroll past, but for yourself. For anyone who thinks they must swallow humiliation just to belong. Tell it plain, on paper." Mila breathed deeply, letting the suggestion settle. It wasn't revenge, it was reclamation. She looked at the ring one last time, then set it on the table beside her empty cup. A decision had been born in the quiet, She would not return to that house, not as a silent guest, not as an obedient bride. The night ended with light creeping through the curtains, her parents resting nearby, her cousin sketching outlines of possibility. The calls had stopped, but she knew they would return. This time she would not answer with silence. She would answer with truth. The call came in the quiet of afternoon, when Mila had just begun to believe the storm might rest. The number was unfamiliar, the voice calm, deeper than Omari's but carrying the same family cadence. "Mila, my name is Pavel. I am Omari's older brother." For a moment she froze. She had heard his name whispered like a cautionary tale, someone erased from gatherings and photographs. To hear him now, alive and unbroken, was like hearing a forbidden song. He asked for a meeting, not with urgency but with respect. She agreed. They met at a small cafe tucked along U Street, its windows fogged from winter breath. Pavel arrived first, tall, shoulders broad but a posture relaxed, his eyes lined with years of both struggle and freedom. He stood as she entered, greeting her with a handshake firm and warm. There was no shadow of the family's coldness in his manner. They spoke over coffee, steam rising between them like a curtain pulled back. He told his story without bitterness, as though retelling a lesson he had already accepted. "I married a woman they called unworthy," he said. "She had no pedigree, no gallery of ancestors. She had only her mind, her laughter, and her courage. That was enough for me, but not for them." The words settled heavy but true. Mila leaned closer, caught by the steadiness in his voice. He continued, "They gave me a choice. Leave her or leave them. I left them. And let me tell you, walking away was not a loss. It was a victory." Mila searched his face, waiting for traces of regret, but found none. His eyes glowed with quiet triumph. "You chose your wife," she said softly. Pavel nodded. "And in choosing her, I chose myself. Respect is not inherited, Mila. Respect is acted out, decision by decision. That's the only heritage worth keeping." For the first time since her own wedding, she felt her chest ease. Here was proof that defiance did not always end in ruin. It could end in freedom. As their conversation shifted, Pavel leaned forward with a new offer. "I have contacts with a cultural journal in Vienna. They look for voices who can see through layers of pretense, someone who knows what legacy really means. I could recommend you as a contributor, freelance at first." Mila blinked, startled not by the opportunity itself, but by the way he offered it. With no strings, no conditions, only trust in her talent. She thought of Nyla's words, "Write it," not as a post but as truth on paper. Here was the door to do exactly that. The cups emptied, the day outside darkened, but the fire inside her burned steadier than ever. She had entered the cafe as someone trying to survive humiliation. She left with a new mirror, Pavel's story a reminder that dignity is not given but seized. Walking out into the evening air, Mila carried the weight of a simple but unshakable phrase. Respect is a choice in action. It began as a whisper, soft enough to dismiss. A murmur after receptions, a half-smile at dinners, a pause before introductions. But within weeks, the story took shape across polished tables and private halls. Dor Iman had humiliated her son's bride at the family table. Not once, but twice. And the bride had left. In circles where elegance was measured not only by wealth but by control, the charge was devastating. It was not that Iman had spoken cruel words. Cruelty was common enough, but that she had done it under her own roof, to a guest of honour, and in a language meant to exclude. The veneer of culture cracked, and behind it others saw only arrogance. Aunt Hestia, once Iman's staunchest ally, was the first to speak aloud. At a luncheon, with crystal glasses raised around her, she shook her head. "It was not beautiful," she said, her voice clear enough for all to hear. "Whatever the intent, humiliating a guest is beneath dignity." The table went silent. Eyes shifted toward Iman, but no one rushed to defend her. The ripple spread. Invitations slowed. Some of the family's oldest friends sent regrets to dinners they once never missed. Others arrived but kept their smiles tighter, their laughter shorter. The air that once flattered the Gorofs now cooled against them. Nick, long the man of soft laughter and practiced anecdotes, felt the sting most keenly. At a reception he approached Mila quietly, away from his wife's gaze. His hands trembled, and his words came out in fragments. "Perhaps we misstepped. Perhaps things were harsher than intended. You must understand traditions are difficult. I apologize, if only for my silence. The apology was partial, delayed, dressed in excuses, but it was the closest he had ever come to admitting the truth. Mila accepted it with a nod, but her eyes held no warmth. An apology without responsibility was a gesture without weight. Omari's path was the most tortured of all. He drifted between two worlds, the home where he was bound by loyalty, and the woman whose dignity he could not meet with courage. His calls multiplied, his visits awkward. He pleaded with Mila not to forgive his mother, not to forget the insults, but simply to wait for him to find strength, wait for the family to soften, wait for time to mend what pride had broken. But waiting was not action, waiting was surrender. Each time he left her apartment with promises, he carried nothing but indecision back into the night. And so the ricochet grew louder. What began as a whisper became a reputation. The woman who once embodied refinement was now spoken of as the hostess who lost control of her tongue, and the son who could not defend his bride became the man whose silence defined him. For Mila, it was confirmation of what she already knew. Truth eventually unmasks pretense. Yet in Omari's hesitation, she saw the shadow of a choice still unmade. The weight of silence had grown unbearable. Omari finally stood before his mother, not in the parlour of polished glass, but in the smaller room where family matters were settled. His violin rested in its case against the wall, unopened. His voice trembled at first, but steadied with effort. "Mother, I need you to hear me. Mila deserves respect. She is my wife. She should not have been treated as an outsider at our table." Iman turned from the window, her pearls glinting against the burgundy fabric at her throat. Her face carried no trace of guilt, only the calm certainty of command. "Traditions are not to be touched," she said coldly. "They are what built this house, what gave you your place. One woman's pride is not reason to undo generations." Omari clenched his hands, searching for the strength to push harder. But what if those traditions wound more than they honour? What if they destroy the very family they claim to protect? His voice cracked at the edges, but it carried a truth he had long buried. For a heartbeat, the room stood still. Nick shifted in the background, eyes lowered, as if bracing for another storm. Imari's lips pressed into a thin line, then curved into a smile as sharp as glass. "You're young, Omari. You confuse a sentiment with a principle. Families do not bend for feelings. They endure because they hold the line." The words cut deeper than he expected. He had hoped for recognition, a softening, even the smallest admission. Instead, he faced a wall polished by decades of certainty. His shoulders sank. The silence that followed was his surrender. In another corner of the city, Mila packed her belongings into boxes. Each folded blouse, each notebook stacked carefully, was an answer Omari had not given. At the courthouse, she filed papers, annulment, dissolution, whichever term the law demanded. For her, it meant freedom. When Omari came to her door one last time, ring glinting on his hand, his voice carried desperation. "Give me more time," he pleaded. "I'll find a way." Mila shook her head, her tone calm, stripped of anger. "You had the way. It was respect. And you chose silence." The door closed softly behind him. Not with malice, but with finality. Back in the family home, Miss Adeline tidied the dining table after another quiet evening. She paused, hands resting on a drawer that had not been opened in years. From it she drew a faded photograph, a younger Iman, radiant in her youth, seated beside friends, her hand resting warmly on another woman's shoulder. Across the back, in looping script, was written, "Once we knew what respect meant." Adeline laid the photo carefully on the polished table, where a man could not miss it. Then she walked away, leaving silence behind. 12 months passed with the rhythm of a new life. Mila had exchanged the suffocating weight of family dinners for the freedom of her own voice. What began as short essays turned into a steady column in the diaspora press, her words travelling farther than she ever imagined. She wrote not of palaces or pedigrees, but of dignity, of culture as an ethic rather than a decoration. Readers wrote back with gratitude. Her clarity gave them language for wounds they had carried in silence. Assignments carried her abroad to conferences and cultural forums. In Italy, she stepped onto a balcony overlooking a city square and whispered to herself, "I breathe." In Vienna, she handed in a piece about hidden forms of exclusion, Her heart lightened by the knowledge that she stood on no one's leash. Each trip stretched her sense of self wider, until the memory of that suffocating table felt like another life. Her circle grew too. Pavel and his wife welcomed her as kin, their children running to her with laughter when she visited. Around their table, meals ended in stories rather than judgments. The warmth was ordinary and therefore precious. She saw in Pavel not just the shadow of what Omari could have been, but the proof that courage could build a family worth belonging to. Meanwhile, Omari's career soared. His talent was never in question. The year ended with a grand solo performance advertised in bright posters across the city. The hall filled with admirers, critics, and patrons. His bow drew music that shimmered with brilliance, each note precise, each phrase aching with beauty. Applause roared when he finished, the kind of ovation that promised immortality. But amid the flood of faces and flowers, one seat remained empty. It was the seat he searched for, the one where Mila should have been. He lowered his head at the curtain call, bowing into the echo of absence. At the reception afterward, Nick leaned close to his wife, voice low, eyes darting to the polished crowd. "We lost a daughter-in-law, but at least we kept our face." He spoke it like consolation, like proof their sacrifices had meaning. Iman stood still, her earrings glinting under the lights. She did not answer. Perhaps she had not heard him. Or perhaps the music still ringing in her ears was too sharp to allow denial. For once, her silence did not command the room. It only lingered, thin and uneasy. The words spread faster than she imagined. Her essay appeared in the Diaspora Journal on a quiet Monday morning. The headline was simple, almost stark. "Nobility is not a title, it is an action." Within hours it was shared, discussed, copied into feeds she had never seen. Readers underlined sentences, sent them to friends, whispered them in classrooms and cafes. She had put into plain words as what many had felt but not dared to voice. Respect is lived, not inherited. Mila watched the reactions pour in, not with vanity but with relief. Her truth was no longer locked inside her chest. It was now a seed carried by strangers. By evening her phone rang. Pavel's voice warmed the line. "I'm proud of you," he said simply. "You did what I could not. You told it to the world." His invitation followed naturally. "Come to Vienna. Share your words in person. Our table has room for you." She stood by her window as night fell, the city alive with distant lights. A year ago, those lights had mocked her with promises she could not trust. Tonight, they reflected possibility. She whispered to herself, "I no longer fear the view." The ring no longer weighed her hand. The silence of waiting was gone. Far across town, another choice was quietly unfolding. Miss Adeline placed her apron neatly on the counter, the keys to the Gorov household beside it. She did not announce her departure, did not leave a letter. She simply walked out, her back straight, and turned toward the small church where the choir gathered each week. Her voice, once muffled by the walls of obedience, now joined harmonies of faith. For her too, tradition ended, and freedom began. In the polished halls of elite gatherings, Dr. Iman still held her posture, but whispers followed her more openly now. At a round table on ethics, she sat poised, while a speaker said calmly, "Apology is also a form of culture." For the first time, Iman did not answer. She smoothed the edge of her dress, pearls trembling faintly at her throat. Silence filled the space where her authority once lived. Mila closed her laptop at midnight. Her essay already echoed across screens she would never see. The hum of the city faded, replaced in her room by the soft strum of a guitar from the radio. Soul, gentle and steady. She leaned back, eyes closing, the final truth settling like a benediction. She had not chosen lineage, not legacy polished in glass. She had chosen dignity, and that choice had given her back her life.